What if I told you that most of your decisions are made before you even become aware of them? For centuries, we believed our conscious mind was the captain, steering our every action. But what if it's just the narrator telling a story after the fact? Neuroscience and psychology now reveal something incredible. Beneath the surface of your awareness lies the unconscious mind. It's a massive, hidden network of impulses, memories, and emotional patterns that are constantly shaping how you see the world and what you do next. Sigmund Freud was among the first to bring this idea to the mainstream, but modern science has taken it much further. Back in 1983, an experiment by neuroscientist Benjamin Libet completely changed the game. He asked people to press a button whenever they felt the urge. What he found was shocking. Their brains showed activity to start the movement hundreds of milliseconds before they consciously decided to act. Your brain made the decision before you knew it. Think about that. But it gets even crazier. More recent studies using fMRI scans have shown that scientists can predict a person's choice up to 7 seconds before they're aware of making it. 7 whole seconds. This suggests that what we call free will might often be our conscious mind simply catching up and creating a reason for an action that was already in motion. This hidden system, this shadow mind, influences everything, from the foods you crave to the fears that hold you back, to the people you fall in love with. It's the invisible driver in the seat of your life. So the next time you make a choice, ask yourself, who really made it? Thanks for watching. And if you want to explore more about the mysteries of the mind, make sure to subscribe. The unconscious mind isn't mystical, it's biological. It's architecture. When people imagine the unconscious, they often picture something abstract, a dark psychological basement filled with forgotten memories. But modern neuroscience reveals something very different. The unconscious is not a place. It is a network of interacting brain systems, constantly processing information outside awareness. At any given moment, your brain processes roughly 11 million bits of sensory data per second. Yet conscious awareness can handle only about 40 bits. That means the overwhelming majority of perception, interpretation, and decision-making happens beneath consciousness. 3 major brain systems form the backbone of what we experience as the unconscious mind. The first is the default mode network. This network includes the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and angular gyrus. It becomes highly active when the mind turns inward during daydreaming, self-reflection, imagination, and autobiographical thinking. For a long time, scientists believed the brain was resting when the DMN activated. Now we know the opposite. The brain is actually constructing the story of who you are. It is replaying memories, simulating future scenarios, analyzing social interactions, and updating your internal model of reality. In other words, even when you think you are doing nothing, your unconscious mind is busy predicting the future. The second system is the limbic network, which includes the amygdala, hippocampus, and hypothalamus. This network processes emotional significance. It constantly evaluates, is this safe? Is this dangerous? Is this rewarding? These evaluations occur in milliseconds, long before conscious reasonings. For example, studies using subliminal image exposure show that the amygdala responds to threatening faces even when participants cannot consciously see them. The brain has already judged the situation before awareness even begins. The third system is the basal ganglia, the brain's habit engine. Located deep within the brain, the basal ganglia automate behaviors that were once conscious. Driving a car, typing on a keyboard, or even the tone you use in conversation can become procedural patterns stored here. These patterns operate without deliberate thought. Together, these networks form what neuroscientists call a predictive brain. Rather than reacting to reality, the brain constantly predicts reality and compares incoming information to those predictions. If the prediction matches what happens, the brain barely updates anything. If the prediction fails, the brain rewrites its internal model. Most of this updating happens unconsciously, and this is why the unconscious mind holds so much power. Chapter 3. Repressed emotions. The energy that doesn't disappear when emotions are buried. They don't die. They go underground. Freud famously described repression as the mind's way of pushing unacceptable emotions into the unconscious. For decades, this concept was dismissed as unscientific. But modern neuroscience has discovered mechanisms that closely resemble what Freud was describing. When people attempt to suppress emotional thoughts, brain imaging shows increased activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive control region. This area attempts to inhibit activity in the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system. In simple terms, the brain tries to lock emotions away. But this strategy rarely works permanently. In 1994, social psychologist Daniel Wegner demonstrated what he called the white bear effect. Participants were instructed not to think about a white bear. Predictably, the thought appeared in their minds far more frequently than normal, which means suppressed emotions remain active beneath awareness. They simply find other ways to express themselves. Sometimes they appear as anxiety, sometimes as unexplained anger, sometimes as physical symptoms such as headaches, fatigue, or chronic tension. Clinical psychologists often see these patterns in therapy. A person may feel irrational anger toward authority figures without understanding why, until they uncover a childhood experience of humiliation by a teacher or parent. The emotional energy was never resolved. It was only buried. Neuroscientists studying emotional memory suggest that suppressed experiences remain encoded in the amygdala and hippocampus, influencing emotional reactions long after the original event is forgotten. This means a person may genuinely believe they have moved on from an experience, while their brain continues reacting to it. The shadow mind remembers even when the conscious mind does not. Chapter 4. Hidden desires and the brain's reward system. Your brain may want things your conscious mind refuses to admit. Desire is driven largely by the brain's dopamine system, particularly circuits connecting the ventral tegmental area, nucleus accumbens, and prefrontal cortex. This system evolved to motivate behavior necessary for survival, seeking food, forming bonds, and exploring new environments. But dopamine does not simply respond to rewards. It responds to anticipation. The brain releases dopamine when it predicts something desirable may happen, and those predictions are shaped heavily by past emotional experiences. If certain patterns repeatedly produced emotional intensity, even painful intensity, the brain may unconsciously seek them again. Psychologists often observe this in romantic relationships. Someone who grew up with inconsistent affection may find themselves repeatedly drawn to emotionally unavailable partners. Consciously, they want stability, but unconsciously, the brain associates emotional unpredictability with meaningful attachment. This phenomenon is sometimes called trauma bonding. Brain imaging studies show that emotionally intense relationships activate both dopamine reward pathways and stress circuits. This combination creates powerful reinforcement. The brain interprets emotional turbulence as significance, which means people may unknowingly pursue relationships that recreate unresolved emotional experiences. From the outside, it looks irrational. From the brain's perspective, it is simply repeating the strongest emotional patterns it knows. Hidden desires are not random. They are shaped by emotional memory. And until those memories become conscious, the brain continues following the same script. Chapter 5: The Pattern Machine. Your brain is so desperate to find meaning that it will invent it. Humans are extraordinary pattern detectors. Our ancestors survived because they could quickly identify cause and effect. Which plants were poisonous, which animals were dangerous, which strangers could be trusted. But the same system that protects us can also mislead us. The brain uses pattern recognition shortcuts, known as heuristics, to interpret complex information quickly. These shortcuts operate largely outside conscious awareness. One powerful example is the implicit association effect. In experiments using the implicit association test IAT, researchers discovered that people form automatic associations between concepts even when they consciously reject them. These unconscious biases can influence decisions about trust, attractiveness, competence, and danger within milliseconds. And because they occur beneath awareness, they feel like intuition. But intuition is often simply rapid pattern recognition based on past experiences. Another example of unconscious patterning appears in what psychologists call confirmation bias. Once the brain forms a belief, it begins selectively noticing evidence that supports it. Information that contradicts the belief is often ignored. Neuroscientific studies show that when people encounter information that challenges their worldview, the brain's amygdala and insula activate, producing discomfort. The brain then searches for ways to dismiss the information. In this way, unconscious beliefs protect themselves. This mechanism explains why people often repeat the same mistakes. The brain's internal model filters reality to confirm what it already expects. The shadow mind is not merely storing memories. It is constantly predicting patterns. And those predictions quietly shape the reality you perceive. Chapter 6: Emotional Memory. When the past controls the present, your brain remembers emotional experiences long after you forget them. Not all memories are equal. The brain treats emotionally intense experiences as high-priority data. When something emotionally significant occurs, the amygdala signals the hippocampus to strengthen the memory trace. This process is enhanced by stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, which increase neural consolidation. As a result, emotional experiences become deeply embedded in the brain's predictive system. Even decades later, similar situations can activate the same neural circuits. A tone of voice, a facial expression, a subtle shift in social dynamic. These cues may seem insignificant, yet they can trigger powerful emotional reactions. One famous neuroscience experiment illustrates this phenomenon. Participants were shown neutral images paired with mild electric shocks. Later, when the images were presented again without the shock, participants still displayed fear responses, increased heart rate, sweating, and amygdala activation. Their brains had learned the emotional association, and once learned, it was difficult to erase. This mechanism explains why early life experiences often shape adult personality. If a child grows up in an environment where affection is unpredictable, their brain may learn to expect instability in relationships. If criticism was constant, the brain may become hypersensitive to signs of rejection. These emotional templates operate beneath awareness. They quietly influence decisions about trust, intimacy, and risk. From the outside, a person's reactions may appear irrational, but inside the brain, they are perfectly logical responses to patterns encoded long ago. The past is not just remembered, it is actively shaping the present. Chapter 7. The Inner Narrator. The story your brain tells you. What if the voice inside your head is not telling the truth, but simply telling a story that makes you feel in control? Most people believe their identity is stable and coherent. We think we understand why we act the way we do. But neuroscience suggests something far stranger. The brain continuously constructs a narrative after events have already happened. This phenomenon is sometimes called the interpreter. Neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga discovered it while studying patients whose brains had undergone split brain surgery, a procedure once used to treat severe epilepsy. In these patients, the left and right hemispheres of the brain could no longer communicate normally. In one experiment, researchers showed a command to the patient's right hemisphere, something the verbal left hemisphere could not see. The patient stood up and began walking. When asked why they were walking, the patient confidently replied, "I'm going to get a drink." But this explanation was completely invented. The patient had no conscious access to the original instruction. Yet the brain immediately created a logical story. This revealed something extraordinary. The brain cannot tolerate unexplained behavior. When we act without knowing why, the mind quickly constructs a narrative that feels true. This narrative-building system is heavily linked to the default mode network, the same brain network involved in self-reflection and identity. The DMN constantly integrates memories, beliefs, and predictions into a coherent sense of self. But coherence is not the same as accuracy. Psychologists have repeatedly demonstrated that people can misremember events, reinterpret motives, and reshape personal history to maintain a stable identity. In one study at Princeton University, participants watched the same football game but supported opposing teams. When asked to recall the events later, each group remembered the game completely differently, emphasizing fouls by the opposing team while ignoring those committed by their own. Their brains were not lying intentionally. They were protecting a narrative. Your brain's narrator exists to maintain psychological stability, not objective truth, which means the shadow mind may influence behavior long before the narrator explains it. Chapter 8: Projection. Seeing your shadow in others. Sometimes the traits that disturb you most in other people are reflections of something hidden inside yourself. One of the most fascinating psychological defenses is projection, originally described by Freud and later expanded by Carl Jung. Projection occurs when a person unconsciously attributes their own unacceptable thoughts or feelings to someone else. Instead of recognizing an internal conflict, the mind externalizes it. Modern neuroscience offers insights into how this might occur. Brain imaging. Studies show that when individuals evaluate the emotions or intentions of others, activity increases in the insular and anterior cingulate cortex, regions associated with internal emotional awareness. These same regions activate when people reflect on their own emotional states. In other words, the brain uses the same neural systems to understand ourselves and others. This overlap creates an interesting possibility. If a person struggles to accept certain feelings within themselves, anger, jealousy, insecurity, the brain may interpret similar signals in other people more strongly. For example, someone who unconsciously fears their own competitiveness might perceive others as aggressive or hostile. A person who represses vulnerability may judge emotional openness as weakness. In clinical psychology, projection often appears in relationships. Partners may accuse each other of behaviors they themselves struggle with internally. And because the projection feels real, conflicts can escalate rapidly. Carl Jung believed that recognizing these projections was essential for psychological development. He called this process integrating the shadow. Instead of rejecting hidden traits, individuals learn to acknowledge them as part of the human psyche. Ironically, the qualities we fear most in ourselves often contain untapped psychological energy. Creativity, ambition, and assertiveness sometimes hide behind the same emotions we were taught to suppress. Chapter 9: Entering the Shadow. Tools for self-discovery. If the unconscious shapes so much of our lives, is it possible to explore it without getting lost? While the unconscious mind cannot be fully controlled, it can be observed and gradually understood. Several practices help reveal patterns that normally remain hidden. One of the oldest methods is free association, developed in early psychoanalysis. In this technique, a person speaks or writes continuously without filtering their thoughts. At first, the material seems random, but over time, recurring themes emerge. Unresolved conflicts, fears, desires, and emotional patterns. Modern neuroscience suggests this process works because it reduces activity in the prefrontal filtering system, allowing deeper associations to surface. Another powerful tool is dream observation. During REM sleep, the brain becomes highly active in emotional and memory processing regions, while the prefrontal cortex becomes less active. This state allows the brain to combine memories and emotions in unusual ways. Dreams often contain symbolic representations of unresolved experiences. Psychologists do not interpret dreams as literal messages, but recurring dream themes can reveal emotional concerns the waking mind avoids. Meditation also provides access to unconscious processes. Brain scans show that long-term meditation practitioners exhibit reduced activity in the default mode network, which quiets the constant narrative about the self. When this narrative softens, underlying emotional patterns become easier to observe. Instead of reacting automatically, individuals begin noticing thoughts and emotions as mental events rather than facts. This shift creates psychological distance, and that distance allows insight. Self-discovery is not about eliminating the unconscious. It is about bringing its patterns into awareness. Once patterns become visible, they lose much of their power. Chapter 10. Mastering the Shadow Mind. You cannot eliminate the unconscious mind, but you can stop it from running your life. The shadow mind is not an enemy. It evolved to process vast amounts of information quickly and efficiently. Without unconscious processing, human cognition would collapse under the weight of constant decision-making. But problems arise when unconscious patterns remain completely invisible. Awareness changes everything. When people begin observing their emotional reactions, they activate the prefrontal cortex, the brain's center for regulation and reflection. Over time, this strengthens neural pathways associated with self-control and cognitive flexibility. Psychologists call this process metacognition, thinking about your own thinking. Simple practices can gradually build this ability. For example, trigger tracking. Whenever a strong emotional reaction occurs, pause and ask, what exactly triggered this feeling? Often, the answer reveals a deeper pattern. Cognitive reframing. The brain automatically interprets events based on past experiences. By consciously questioning those interpretations, new neural pathways form. Deliberate discomfort. Avoidance strengthens fear circuits. Gradually confronting uncomfortable emotions teaches the brain that they are survivable. Reflection rituals. Journaling, therapy, or structured self-reflection helps organize unconscious material into conscious understanding. Over time, these practices change the brain's architecture. Research on neuroplasticity shows that repeated reflection strengthens communication between the prefrontal cortex and limbic system, allowing emotional impulses to be regulated rather than suppressed. The goal is not perfection, it is integration. The unconscious mind holds not only fear and conflict, but also creativity, intuition, and deep emotional intelligence. When the shadow is ignored, it controls behavior from the darkness. When it is understood, it becomes a source of psychological power. And perhaps the most important realization is this: you are not only the voice in your head, you are also the awareness that can observe that voice. And that awareness is where real freedom begins.